Good afternoon, Divanauts. Welcome once again to your channel on anything and everything Latin American studies called Cronista de Indias by Professor Andrea Lorena Fernandez. Thank you once again for viewing this channel, subscribing below, commenting. We appreciate sincerely all of the affection you can give us. Over the course of the last 3 weeks, we completed the episode triptych dedicated to America's Phoenix, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. In episode 6, we discussed her poetry. In 7, we did theater. And in 8, we worked with her answer, or the prose, to Sor Filotea. The current episode will be the last of the first unit in Latin American Divas course by Cronista de Indias, focusing on the colonial period, or Barroco de Indias for our purposes. The next 10 or so episodes will focus on women's agency in the 19th century in Latin America, from independence to the early republics. Without further ado, this is Latin American Divas Season 1, Episode 9, Antonio-Catalina de Erauso, the Virago, Lieutenant Nun, and Transgender Conquistador. In this lesson, we will explore 5 topics. 1. The War of Arauco. 2. Catalina or Antonio? Which one is it? Number 3. The Virago, an early modern explanation for transgenderism. 4. Popular culture and its appropriation of Antonio de Erauso. 5. Narrative examples that show that the Virago is capitalizing on the most popular novelistic genre of the period, the Picaresque novel from the 17th century, to sell volumes and legitimize his experience as a man, as a woman performing as a man, or preferably just as a man. When we discuss the War of Arauco, we have to remember that it lasts 3 centuries, from 1535 to 1818. And within Antonio de Erauso's lifetime, there are 3 sections to the War of Arauco. There's conquest, offense, and defense. With conquest, you see the arrival of Pedro de Valdivia and settling in the north of the Biobío River, and the conquest of the Mapuche tribes, which is an umbrella term for Cuncos, Huiliche, Huenchenche, and Picunche tribes, or people, native nations. This takes place from 1547 to 1598. The second episode, or the second section, is the offense, where they try to expand territory southward from 1601 to 1612. Local professional militias from every town in Chile became a paid professional army, although indigenous slavery was still legal, and they oftentimes supplemented their income by stealing natives and selling them over. The natives sometimes would steal Spanish people and trade them among themselves, so it was gone back and forth. And they employed exemplary punishment laws, so this is the period of the bloodiest encounters. Defense, the third period, is from 1621 to 1625, and in this one we are a little bit more pacifist and evangelizing. That is our mentality: evangelize the Mapuche territory, diplomatic conquest, if you will. Criminalization of indigenous slavery doesn't lessen the fact that they're still selling Indian slaves, and they try to maintain the Biobío River frontier. The Hispanic Mapuche coexistence is hostile from 1625 to 1818. In fact, being sent to Chile was seen as a punishment. Let's read from Catalina de Erauso's, or Antonio de Erauso's, experience in Chile. He says, "I was obliged to go to Paikavi and suffer hard times for 3 years after having lived such a carefree life earlier. But of the great Indian invasion there, we always lived with our weapons and ready until finally Governor Alonso de Sarabia and all the Chilean troops arrived. We all joined forces with him, and 5,000 men camped on the open plains of Valdivia with a great deal of discomfort." Notice that he keeps repeating discomfort. This is a punishment. He was sent there because he was brawling in Lima. So this is exile. "The Indians captured and attacked said Valdivia. We went to meet them and fought them for 3 or 4 times, always besting and destroying them, but in the last battle their reinforcements came. Things went badly for us, and they killed many of our men, our captains and my ensign. They also took our standard." The role of the ensign is to be the standard bearer, and in this period, capturing the flag was seen as the victory in many instances. So the ensign was the person that had a sign pointing to them saying, "Here I am, attack me." The ensign in this battle is killed. Check out what Antonio does. Seeing they make off with it, the flag, and two other mounted soldiers went after them through the great multitude, charging and killing and being wounded in turn. Soon after 1 or 3 dead fell. The two of us kept on, and we got on the standard, but a lance thrust and felled my companion. I, with a bad wound on the leg, killed the cacique, who had it in his possession, took the standard away, and spurred my horse, charging, killing, and wounded indiscriminately. Badly injured, pierced by 3 arrows, and with a very painful lance wound on the left shoulder, I finally reached our men and fell from my horse. Several rushed to my help, among them my brother, whom I had not seen, and this was a great consolation to me. So we should know that uh, Chile was conquered by a large contingency of Basque people coming from the Euskadi region in Spain, and oftentimes they would have known each other, might have even have been relatives, as in this case with Antonio, who meets his or her brother in Chile. Let's talk about him or her. In the prose, Antonio de Erauso predominates with the male pronoun él or he. So I will try to use he for the rest of the episode, though I may sometimes use she depending on what I see on the page. But he would have liked us to have imagined him as a male person, so we're going to go with that. He fled from the Basque country in northern Spain from a convent before taking vows, dressed as a boy. Catalina originally came from a poor family who could not afford to marry her off, so they chucked her away in a black veil nun convent. And he immediately refused all forms of feminization. It was not something that was for him. Lived as a male conquistador in America until 20 years later he confessed his true sex to Bishop Agustin de Carvajal in Lima to avoid being executed. This happens in 1623. He constantly switches jobs, names, and locations. Once he is discovered as a female in one place, or discovered doing something he shouldn't be doing, like seducing other women or brawling in a pub, he runs away to the next town. So he really did travel the entire length of the Pacific coast of South America. As I said, he seduces women, withdraws, gambled, cheated, and stole, fought against the Mapuches in Chile, and killed his own brother Manuel de Erauso in a duel, for which he seems to lack absolute empathy. There is no indication that he's in pain that he's killing his brother. Notoriety is gained within his lifetime. King Philip IV is so impressed with this female male conquistador, this Virago, that he grants him land, money, and right to wear pants. Pope Urban VIII is also impressed with Antonio's performance in America and endorses the male attire. So you have both king and pope who say this one person in the universe who is biologically female but it performs as male may go on performing as male. He lived on as Antonio de Erauso in Mexico, transporting merchandise by mules until 1650. Now, muling is really, really hard. There's a movie with Hugh Jackman. Go watch it. It's called Australia. It goes on forever. It should have ended 30 minutes before the actual ending. But go check it out. It's a tough job. And Antonio de Erauso chose that occupation until the end of his life. So, how do you get away with murder and wearing pants? The Bishop Carvajal had Antonio de Erauso examined by virtuous matrons who proved his virginity. So, by reverting to Marianismo, check out episode 4, she sold her story to the Pope and King as a total renunciation of femininity, and that somehow was permissible. Rather than being masculine, it was renouncing all things that were female, and that made sense. Collective fascination with the bizarre, like Don Quixote in the Baroque, also enables a character or a person like Antonio de Erauso to coexist with everybody else. Note that he never tried to change the inequality between the sexes, though those were obvious. Instead, she denies sex, repudiates the convent, the habit, all femininity, and employs the machista personality. Check out episode 4. So, what is a virago? Vir in Latin means man from the word virile in English, and ago is a feminine suffix. So, a masculine woman is a vir ago. And this brings us to the dichotomy of the virgin, saint, warrior woman like Athena, Minerva, or even Virgin Mary that fight as men, act as men, but remain virgins. And that somehow redeems their temporary masculinity. We Also, it comes from Aristotle's animal continuum, and it forms the pre-industrial unisexual system. Let's go to Aristotle's animal continuum. Aristotle classifies animals according to their godly essence, whatever godly essence is to Aristotle, in a continuum where the male of each species surpasses the female in terms of perfection. So if you have the male human being, then the female human being, then I don't know, a horse creature, and then a mare creature, and then a fly, and then the female version of the fly, all the way down to the microscopic organisms that Aristotle couldn't see. But he would have assumed that the female of each would have been less godly than the male of the same thing. How the one-sex model we're going to use for this textbook, Making Sex, Body, and Gender from the Greeks to Freud by Thomas Lacour, I cited profusely. This one says, the history of the representation of anatomical differences between man and woman is thus extraordinarily independent from the actual structures of these organs or of what was known about them. Ideology, not accuracy of observation, determined how they were seen and which differences would matter. So in the early modern period, they believed that there were not two genders but one, and the only difference between them was the degree of godly essence within. How does Antonio-Catalina, how is he allowed to perform as male? His exceptionally military service helps, but from the post perspective, for example, he is more of a virile woman with that godly essence, an extra dash of godly essence, then and can naturally wear pants because of it. Conversely, in the one-sex fluid economy, let's go to the next quote in this one. Conversely, in the one-sex fluid economy, strange or feminine men may lactate. Hieronymus Cardanus, court physician to the King of Denmark, says on the basis of travelers' accounts that in some places, quote, almost all the men have great quantity of milk in their breasts, unquote. An Italian commentator cites one of Cardanus' near-to-home cases, quote, Antonio Benso, age 34, pale, fat, and scarcely bearded, had much milk in his breasts and could feed a baby, unquote. Men, if they were of cold and moist and feminine complexion, were either quite likely to have milk in their breasts, and thought an English doctor, a view shared by Joubert, who adds that such men were to be found primarily in the East. Note, the animal continuum is used to justify racism by feminizing the other. So Eastern men over here have less of that godly essence than the European counterparts. He gives, in addition to the evidence in Aristotle, the example of the Syrian count who nourished his child for more than 6 months. This is not to say that metaphorically lactating Christ, whose blood nourishes his church and Mary's milk nourished him, or an infant depicted with the female breasts ready to spurt milk, are to be interpreted as more ethnographic examples of the sort just cited. Because you can have more or less of this godly essence, males may have fewer of it and exhibit feminine traits like lactation. And there are paintings and ivories and sculptures of lactating Christ from the Middle Ages that support this evidence. But they do suggest that, in the world of one sex, the body was far less fixed and far less constrained by categories of biological difference than it came to be after the 18th century. The boundary between a motherly, more feminine Christ, lactating in religious imagery, and men with prosaic ethnography in clinical reports is by no means clear. So that's the note, and we should also show you the diagram. So here is a diagram of a vagina and penis according to Vesalius in Fabrica. This is a Renaissance anatomical text. And just from looking at it, I honestly can't tell which one is which. I have to take a look at the caption. And figure 20 on the left is presumably a vagina, and this one is a penis. So they're seeing them as the same organ. This one is just internal and this one is just external. Okay, so saved from execution by revealing her womanhood and virginity, Antonio, or in this case now she's Catalina de Erauso, uses Marianismo to save herself from execution and reverting back to the female version of the one-sex model. For this, we're going to need page 47. The next morning the Lord Bishop said Mass, which I attended, and I afterward gave thanks. He withdrew to save breakfast, and took me with him. He expounded his sermon, and told me that mine was the most curious case of this sort which he had ever heard in his life, and finally said, "But is it true?" "Yes, sir," I said. He replied, "Don't be afraid or affronted by this particular nature stains of the imagination." "Sir," I said, "it is true, and that your lordship wants to make sure by having me examined by some women, I will be willing to do it." He said, "I'm glad to hear you say that, and I agree." I withdrew because I was in his reception at that time. At noon I ate and rested a bit, and in the afternoon about 4 two matrons came in, examined me, were convinced later that they swore by the bishop that examined me to a sufficient degree, and they determined that she was a virgin. Note that the numbers in it are inaccurate. Were there 2 women or 4? Wouldn't you remember how many gynecologists are there in a room? Right. So Antonio might not be a perfectly reliable narrator. In popular culture, the idea of the woman warrior is really appealing. So there were plays written about Catalina Antonio de Erauso within his lifetime, and the autobiography was published in 1894, so way later after it was written, but immediate translations came in French, German, and English, so people really liked it. The play within her lifetime was one by Juan Pérez Montalbán from 1626, and it was called The Ensign Nun. It was performed in Madrid. There are 2 Mexican classical film movies. One is from 1940 with Maria Felix, and the other one is from 1987. And in both cases, uh, Antonio never looks like an Antonio because they picked the most gorgeous women in the silver screen of the period to play this character. So it's not very believable. The narrative that the Virago uses, that Antonio de Erauso uses, he capitalizes on the picaresque novel of the 17th century. Antonio understands that the audience respect is integral to his validation as a male. And let's go over the characteristics of the picaresque novel. Our example is going to be Lazarillo de Tormes. He's a rogue and anti-hero and usually very young. Hunger is a constant trait of his entire existence. You call him mozo de muchos amos because he has many bosses. He goes from job to job to job, survives through deceit and cunning, narrates in the first person, and is very unreliable. And we actually root for him, even though he's the anti-hero, because deep inside, this child has a good heart. So here are some examples of picaresca in Antonio de Erauso. So we're going to go to page 38. I find it. There we go. This is when he arrives in Panama. And there we go. I had my name taken off the list as a cabin boy. I went into the service of Captain Eugenio, my uncle, who, by the way, does not recognize Catalina dressed as Antonio. They go through an entire transatlantic trip, and this uncle doesn't know his niece. Go figure. From there, we went to Nombre de Dios, where we stayed for 9 days. Many of our men died, which made us leave there very quickly. When the silver was already aboard and everything was ready for a return voyage to Spain, I played a major trick on my uncle, making off with about 500 of his pesos. And at 10 at night, when he was asleep, I went to the deck and told the sentries that the captain was sending me ashore on an errand. As they knew me, they let me pass with no trouble, and I jumped ashore, and they never saw me again. I lost my pen. Okay. An hour later, they fired the departure gun and weighed anchored, ready to sail. When the fleet left, I took employment with Capitan Juan de Ibarra, an agent from the Panama Treasury who is still alive today. 4 to 6 days later, we left from Panama, where he lived, and I stayed with him for about 3 months. He did not treat me well, for he was miserly, and I had to spend all the money I lifted from my uncle until I had no penny left. Thereupon I departed in order to look for better employment elsewhere. When I looked around, I found Juan de Urquiza, there a merchant from Trujillo, and reached an agreement with him. Things went well for me with him, and we were in Panama. We were in Panama for 3 months. So notice he changes employers 3 times. We're gonna go with the second example, and this one is in Lima. He, as I told you, this one is from earlier. He's obliged to travel to Chile, and the reason is he was caught with a lady that he wasn't supposed to be caught with. I thought you were supposed to marry those before you do anything with them, according to the machista model. So, in conclusion, In this episode, we explored one of the most fascinating figures in Latin American divas, are only representative from the transgender community, at least for the purposes of the episode, Antonio de Erauso. We reviewed the war in Arauco, we discussed Antonio or Catalina, we talked about the Virago, or how the early moderns until the 19th century explained transgenderism. We talked about the representations in popular culture and the Picaresque novel. In the next episode, episode 10 of season 1 of Soberanas, we're going to call it Soberanas Republicas, we will lay out the introduction and expectations for the next 10 to 12 episodes of Latin American Divas, starting with the Bourbon reforms. What else are we going to do? Independence, and moving on to industrialization, nationalism, social Darwinism, and indigenismo. Thank you so much for taking the time to learn about Latin American history through the eyes of its mothers, daughters, and sisters. Please subscribe, leave a comment below, give us a like, share this video to ensure that more and more people learn about our heroines and that our history is never forgotten. Now, new episodes for Latin American Divas drop every Friday, so check me out next week. Have a wonderful afternoon. Do epic shit, like the poster says, you gotta do epic shit. And we're gonna do hashtag Antonio, hashtag Catalina, hashtag the Lieutenant Nan.